Yes, it's another outstanding Northern Moronic film production. Oh, you lucky people.
To define energy in a precise and meaningful manner is to define the mystery of mysteries, because life, the universe and everything, to commandeer Douglas Adams' concise summation of existence, are simply different names for that very phenomenon we call energy. So to define energy, dear listener, is something way beyond my pay grade. Please note, I use the totally unsuitable American colloquialism in an attempt, okay, a poor one, to be humorous. However, for legal reasons, and for the benefit of DWP investigators on my case, by the use of the Americanism common in modern parlance, I do not thereby imply, admit, infer, nor declare that I am in receipt of any monies or other remuneration from gainful employment. In fact, it is my belief that the concept of energy in all its guises is beyond current human definition. Albert Einstein's summing up of energy in his famous analogical equation E equals mc squared was limited to express energy in terms of mass. He made no attempt, at least I don't think he did, to define the fundamental enigma that is energy. And he is quite a clever bloke, remember. If Einstein is correct, and I have it on good authority that he is, then energy is finite. This means that there is a limit to the amount of energy contained within or constituting a system. Thus, there is a corresponding limit to the amount of mass in that system. Remember, energy equals mass. Consequently, for the purposes of this discussion, there is a limit to the energy as represented by the system we know as our planet. I refer to our planet not in terms of ownership of the Earth, but rather in the sense that mankind belongs to the Earth, because we are merely a minute quantity of energy that belongs to or is part of the Earth's system. As all living beings have a limited lifespan, any individual organism is simply a temporary custodian of the energy it is, acquires or consumes during its lifetime. This is true whatever trophic level an organism belongs to. In terms that even a Tory can understand, there is a limit to the resources, read energy, of the planet we are currently constrained to inhabit, and mankind has no more right nor entitlement to these resources than any other inhabitant of the earth. It is because of this basic truth that I believe that the overriding cause of the problems the earth is currently facing is the evolution of modern mankind from his hominid ancestors about 10 10 million years ago. A comparatively rapid increase in the physical size of the human brain, coupled with a growing ability to question his place in the overall natural scheme of things, sometimes referred to as intelligence, has allowed mankind to claim a dominant place for himself and enabled him to overexploit his surroundings, while enhancing his inherent competitive nature. In a competitive world, selfishness is the cornerstone of survival. A subtle shift in emphasis regarding mankind's demand for food and the resources required simply to survive, to actively pursuing his apparently inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, triggered mankind's meteoric rise to domination of the planet. The energy we require to live, we call food, and the availability of food is the most important factor controlling population size in a stable environment. There is a natural balance between the consumer and the consumed, or to put that in biological terms, between predator and prey.
You hate yourself, so you hate everybody else. People can make you feel small. Small as a size when age just won't rise fast enough. So you wait for the day to be up, get away, run, run as fast as you can. Over and over and over the hill far away. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Run away. Please come home one day. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Over and over and over and over again. I remember the day in a grey misty way when we boarded the boat to the hook. I was sick to the sea that was beckoning me to its end. And light up the dawn, feeling ragged and worn, I pointed my thumb to the sky. Over and over and over that road again. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Run away. Please come home one day. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Over and over and over and over again. In the light of experience, there's something I want to say. In the light of experience, there's nowhere to run to. Look round yourself, you're nearly running away. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Run away. Please come home one day. Run away. Is it something you're trying to say? Over and over and over and over again.
Due to the hedonistic, wasteful and selfish nature of the human race, mankind is very demanding of energy. Exponential population growth has put an ever-increasing strain upon the Earth's resources, a strain that cannot be sustained indefinitely, while at the same time, during his constant search for profit, power and pleasure, mankind has ignored the environmental needs of every species on Earth, including his own, and has turned a collective blind eye towards the associated problems of waste disposal and pollution. A totally unjustifiable and irresponsible attitude that has caused immense global damage. Like the proverbial ostrich, mankind has buried its head in the sand to the wanton destruction he alone is responsible for. Consequently, man has condemned himself and every other organism to live in a world now unfit for habitation. Radical population control is the only way for mankind to avert his own extinction on this planet. Sadly, voluntary global population control is highly unlikely to occur due to politics, nationalism, vested interests, short-term planning, and man's basic greed and selfishness. But unless radical population control is implemented, nature, by means of the three old favourites, war, pestilence and famine, will inevitably take a hand. Notwithstanding, there are some indications that the political movers and shakers of this world are beginning to wake up to the global blight mankind's self-indulgent anti-Epicureanism has hitherto conveniently chosen to ignore. But this tentative awakening is only happening because they are now realizing that their personal wealth and power are no long-term shield from the effects of the environmental destruction, and that they are individually directly affected now, today, and not out of any altruistic paradigm shift of the common philosophies. The political pretense and contrived deceit of meaningful action at some vague time in the future, instigated by mankind working together in harmony for the greater good of all, was naive, unrealistic and foolish from the start. Cooperation on a global scale will never materialize, in my humble opinion, purely because of human nature being what it is, and man's innate selfishness. I'm afraid his natural instinct for personal survival at all costs will ultimately be the cause of his own demise. While leaders vacillate, dither, and generally adopt indecisive policies of wait and see, there has been a number of enlightened global initiatives. Regrettably, to date, they have been half-hearted, impractical, or stillborn. But while any positive action is to be encouraged and welcomed, I don't believe that the root cause of man's environmental suicide, that is, his own tenure on Earth, will ever be realistically redressed. Because who in a democratic society is going to vote for a government advocating radical population control? However, the good news is that a growing number of concerned, forward-thinking people and conservation groups are attempting to raise public awareness of the imminent dangers the Earth faces, at least at a local level. Some are resorting to radical direct action against the worst environmental offenders, while others have adopted more law-abiding but no less meaningful action by setting up or promoting restoration projects in a bid to help reverse some of the damage already caused while protecting and encouraging the local wildlife. One such initiative is the St. Mary's Local Nature Reserve. This vlog is my visual record of the natural history I have been privileged to observe within the site, together with my personal interpretation of the early human history and folklore of the people of Northumbria. Have you been hurt or injured in an accident at work or anywhere that wasn't your fault? Do you want to make some easy dosh? If your answer to these questions is yes, then you should speak with one of our certifiable claim managers, because we at Lawyers for Nout are experienced ambulance chasers, and we specialise in getting the compensation you're entitled to and generating a nice little earner for ourselves. Apply today at the address on screen, and we will handle your claim on a no-mun, no-fun basis. Remember, where there's a claim or pain, Lawyers for Nout always stand again. Call now. The St. Mary's Island Local Nature Reserve incorporates a small expanse of rocky tidal shoreline with the adjacent clifftop area of submaritime dune, scrub and marshland, with a small sandstone outcrop to seaward, which at high tide becomes the island from which it derives its name. The island is only large enough to accommodate one picturesque fisherman's cottage, built in traditional style, and in more recent times an imposing and impressive lighthouse complex. The area forms part of a larger conservation site of special scientific importance, or SSSI, due to the flora and fauna that exist within the site and the fascinating geological record preserved underfoot. During the geological Carboniferous period, Northumbria was an area of land enclosed within the northernmost supercontinent Laurasia, straddling the equator. About 320 million years ago, deposition of sediments derived from the Caledonian mountain building phase generated the sandstones so prominent and widespread today. Due to regular variations in sea level, Northumbria, as part of a vast low-lying river delta system, was subjected to repeated inundation from the shallow tropical seas it drained into. Regular variations in sea level caused a cyclical shift from waterlogged swamp to a marine environment, which produced the conditions that generated the coals, limestones and ironstones within what became known as the coal measures, that were instrumental in initiating and maintaining the Industrial Revolution. Nationally significant exposures of the coal measures are located within St. Mary's local nature reserve. Close examination of the rocks and fossils contained within the strata, which are easily accessed at low tide along the seashore and cliff face, provides significant and ample clues to the paleo environments in which they were created. The rocks and fossils also provide clear evidence of many species that existed at the time that are now long extinct, including fish, corals, crustaceans, gastropods, and plants, such as the major tree species Lepidodendron. The fossilized tracks of several crustaceans can be seen in rocks very adjacent to the island's causeway. A picture of these tracks is shown at the beginning of this film. Once upon a time, not so long ago, in a galaxy not so far, far away, there was a kingdom known as Northumbria. It was known as Northumbria simply because that was its name. The kingdom of Northumbria was unique, inasmuch as it was not ruled by a king. Instead, the indigenous tribes were governed by the dastardly Department of Works and Pensions, or DWP for short, within a democratic socio-bourgeois narco-syndicalist community. Being the final incarnation of a series of oppressive regimes, the DWP was the immediate successor to the infamous Department of Lost Employment, commonly referred to under the acronym DOLE. This department gained rapid notoriety for causing unprecedented misery and suffering to both the idle and unidle proletariat. Often having no option but to actively seek employment to claim arms, simply to survive, the most unfortunate citizens were mercilessly ridiculed by their more prosperous rate-paying neighbours, who were derisively known as Tories, this demeaning nickname referring to their total opposition to relieving the indigent and essentially starving. The local tribespeople, referred to throughout the known world as Geordies, often lived in abject poverty and constant fear, some being so poor that they didn't know where their next bottle of dog was coming from, and often were required to go into battle bare-chested in all weathers. This unbelievably popular and unique form of democratic government was responsible for unprecedented suffering, record unemployment, needless bureaucracy, and wanton wastage of money and lives. And that, my dear listeners, is a very conservative viewpoint, I think you'll agree. By a strange twist of fate, the enforced lack of investment and underdevelopment of Northumbria, and the resulting unintended conservation of the natural environment and wildlife, ensured that both the countryside and the centres of population did not succumb to the ravages of the modern world, and subsequently remained an almost pristine environment, with the obvious and notable exceptions of North Tyneside. Long before the Geordie Age, evolution by means of natural selection, as proposed by the pioneering and now much celebrated naturalist Charles Darwin, had run roughshod over all the fauna and flora fate had determined should exist within the kingdom. Each species, on pain of death, were often forcibly relocated, sometimes at great personal loss, into many varied and often unsuitable locations, to make way for more office space and parking areas. The daily rise and fall of the ocean's tides determined, please note without popular mandate, the nature and extent of these new and unfamiliar habitats. Amazingly and quite by chance, all those species dispossessed and relocated found that their new habitats actually catered for their every need. Thus Northumbria today acts as home to a multitude of species representing every known taxa. Paleontological study indicates that a number of mass extinctions have occurred throughout world history, in which up to 90% of all species extant at that time suddenly vanished in the blink of an eye, geologically speaking. Research is ongoing in a bid to establish the exact causes of these episodes. As some species also die out between these cataclysmic events, it is very clear that extinction occurs on an individual basis if a species is unable to adapt to its changing environment. One notable extinction, known to have happened since the last ice age, was that of the black polar bear. Scientists unfortunately only have anecdotal evidence relating to the extinction of this species, but it is clear that it actually happened because, let's face it, there aren't any around today, QED. In the case of the northern brown penguin, the precise moment of extinction was actually witnessed by our own film crew. An event, I hasten to speculate, was ultimately instigated by the film crew themselves while filming on location on St. Mary's Island. However, we do have more substantial evidence as to the demise of the rarely spotted striped or Henderson's pelican, because it occurred within living memory and was the subject of a major rescue initiative. The most important factor concerning the decline in numbers of the striped pelican was identified in the 1960s after the major Green Cross initiative was inaugurated. Coordinated Green Cross research identified that striped pelicans were very vulnerable to impact damage when in collision with motor vehicles, particularly during the mating season. The problem stemmed from the fact that pelicans rarely fly during the mating season. Instead, they are very much earthbound, which meant that individuals had to walk in search of a mate. While this behaviour presented the natural problem of increased predation, losses rose by a factor of 4 as pelicans were forced to traverse man-made highways on webbed claws. Losses in urban areas were particularly high when the pelicans were out on the pull. Their unfortunately slow and ungainly gait, coupled with an individual's obviously heightened desire to overcome any obstacle barring their way towards a night on the Raz, left them particularly vulnerable to fast-moving motor vehicles. Once the effect of this behaviour, believed unique to the pelican world, had been established, speed limitations were enforced on all roads in an attempt to reduce the slaughter. Special places were set up to enable the pelican to cross the roads in safety. This led directly to the origin of the urban joke question of, why did the chicken cross the road? Well, now you know the answer. Unfortunately, these measures were either insufficient or implemented too late to save the pelicans from extinction. The legacy of these well-intentioned but ultimately failed attempts to reverse the fortunes of the rarely spotted, now named never spotted, striped pelican can be seen throughout Northumbria, but most significantly within the urban areas where a multitude of redundant and decaying pelican crossings blight our roads, causing unnecessary delay and traffic problems for the modern commuter. This is another urgent appeal to help unemployed and starving cormorants. Millions of cormorants throughout the world are starving purely because they do not have the income to buy food, nor the skills to find food for themselves. Please send whatever you can to the address on screen so that we can provide food and occupational training for the many disenfranchised cormorants throughout the world. Thank you. The unique nature of Northumbria was first recognised by the Roman Mafia when they first ventured north of the River Tyne for the European Champions League. Yeah, right. Some 2,000 years ago, most likely on a Saturday morning. Despite being superior to the foreign hordes militarily and tactically in every department, save the number of infantry, weaponry, efficient mobile logistic and medical support, armour, transport and modern war chariots, and garlic obviously, the odds were really stacked against the local defence forces, or dishevelled rabble, or motley crew, as they were variously called by the victorious invaders. The crucial shortage affecting the local warriors were the direct result of ill-considered penny-pinching but hard-hitting austerity measures, imposed by a weak bureaucratic leadership, traditionally consisting of self-serving, often corrupt, sycophantic tribe elders. Basically, the defence forces were systematically deprived of modern state-of-the-art equipment, financial support and manpower during the peace that had lasted for some considerable time, so that when conflict eventually came, as it always did, the defence forces were immediately at a disadvantage to a would-be well-prepared aggressor and being able to mount an effective response. In fact, the only commodity that this short-sighted policy failed to supply was that of high-grade bullshit, as copious amounts of it were being produced in the relevant council chambers all the time. Does this sound familiar? A sorry state of affairs, or an affair of state that was to recur all too often throughout history. In scenes reminiscent of the 300 blithe Spartans at Thermopylae, the local warriors from the Whitley Bay contingent of the unmounted lifeguards steadfastly withstood the Roman onslaught for hours on end, before morale was brutally crushed as fate dealt a mortal blow to a hitherto unconquered Northumbria, when a small Roman reconnaissance patrol chanced upon the location of the northern brown ale mines and the major ancillary brewing refinery and bottling plants of the industrial heartland. With access to the mines, the most crucial raw material required to maintain a sustained defence posture, now compromised, it was clear that the brewing and refining brown ale would immediately cease if resistance continued, and that current emergency stockpiles would soon be exhausted. Therefore, the painful choice to lay down their bottles was reluctantly made by the High Command, and subsequently an all-official local resistance to the invaders effectively ceased. Once settled into their new training camp, Emperor Augustus XXXI, which translates as August the 31st, unilaterally declared Northumbria an area of special scientific interest, or SSI, pronounced C in Latin. Thus it is historically true that the man from Del Monte did actually say yes, further establishing the now former kingdom an area of outstanding natural beauty, thereby granting protection in perpetuity, or at least a long time, from the ravages of the nasty warlike Mackem clan, located immediately to the south of the region, by making them an offer they couldn't refuse. To mark the Emperor's birthday, which coincidentally fell on the 31st of August, an annual celebration to be known as a bank holiday was established, in which the entire population, save emergency, defence, medical, social, football, corner shop, off-licence and brewery personnel, were granted a rest day from toil and beatings. As the 31st does not fall on the same weekday each year, the bank holiday was scheduled for the Monday prior to that date to create a long weekend for the populace to observe their devotions. In the hope of a fruitful conclusion to the day's traditional recreational activities, the holiday was dedicated to Baal, the Roman god of fertility. And while this may or may not have had an effect on normal fertility, it definitely had an effect on both the birth rate and the weather, because Baal is also the god of storms. Consequently, the weather for the bank holiday was almost guaranteed to be inclement, which I suppose had the desired knock-on effect of deterring alternative outdoor pursuits. Under Roman hegemony, Northumbria quickly began to grow economically and culturally, and some observers were to say that Northumbria had never had it so good. Consequently, the Roman province entered an unprecedented period of prosperity, noted for an extremely high happy index and a strong and stable exchange rate of 2.759 Romano euros to the Geordie groat. An economic achievement, an exchange rate, Tory ideology and dogma singularly have failed to match or even come close to matching at any time in history, to the perpetual detriment of the Geordie people. Consequently, all future generations were condemned to eke out a short and miserable existence in a land of seemingly unlimited wealth, with the notable exception of members of the political leadership and the ever-increasing number of their brown-nosed devotees who had historically been fortunate enough to have amassed or inherited significant personal wealth, universally referred to as fat cats, but better known locally and disparagingly as jammy bar stewards. The fact that this Geordie golden age persisted for over 400 years, with only an average 3% inflationary pressure per annum, is testament to the ideological virtues of a democratic dictatorship, as the populace enjoyed the economic and egalitarian benefits that spring naturally from nationalisation, care in the community, and socio-capitalism. A progressive and carefully balanced compromise between the diametrically opposed concept of socialism and capitalism. Even the local warriors attained a degree of success, overcoming overwhelmingly individual personal and collective failings by becoming united under the Union banner. As life for your average Geordie steadily improved year on year, the provincial governor became very popular, particularly when he declared publicly his obvious and natural aversion to all things Mackem. This popularity spurred the locals to crown him Big Geordie in a lavish ceremony held in the Bar and Snug at the Haymarket Hotel in Newcastle, with northern nostalgia band Lindisfarne providing the audio tribute. Surprisingly, and for the record, it wasn't even Christmas. To make their new Roman friends feel even more at home in this remote yet beautiful part of Christendom, a grateful Geordie nation constructed a number of tourist information centres to help the Roman legionnaires discover and enjoy the hidden Northumbria during their enforced tour of duty. Some of the less charitable commentators were quick to point out alternative theories as to why the Geordies had so readily taken the governor to their hearts, not least the fact that he was mafioso and had a bloody great well-trained and equipped army with him, and that he was rumoured to possess sufficient personal wealth and many worldwide contacts in the brewing trade. All arguments are compelling to some degree. It can only be left to the individual listener to decide on the merit or otherwise of each. Soon after the coronation, and having sufficiently recovered from a brown ale-induced coma, hangover, in a magnanimous gesture of gratitude for being elected king and the support and loyalty the locals had shown him, Big Geordie decided to embark upon a radical programme of social development, aimed at improving the lives of his local slaves, which to be fair wasn't difficult, and the personal wealth of the northern sycophantic elders. To repay his reluctant but smarmy self-seeking hosts for the extravagant coronation due they had laid on, and the traditional crowd doing the big market on a Friday night, he called a meeting of representatives from all over the province to outline his plans as to how he was going to benevolently subjugate them in the future. To honour his guests, he had delicacies and exotic refreshments specially imported from Judas's carryout and Jason's Donovan to solemnise the occasion. At the conclusion of the meeting, which to be hip had been upgraded to a conference, it had been decided basically by Big Geordie himself that the defence of the province should be raised to DEFCON 2, with the building of defensive walls. So Big Geordie had his engineers and architects devise and draw up plans for a wall to cover the full length of the northern and southern extremities of the province, to be permanently manned to guard against invasion or illegal immigrants, particularly from those marauding warlike Mackhams and the inland revenue. Author's note: it must be remembered that this was a time before feminism and political correctness, and there weren't a great many female legionnaires anyway. To further frustrate would-be infiltrators, aggressive or otherwise, Big Geordie proclaimed that the main north-south trunk route via Itin Ario Una, or A1 as it was to become known as locally, be so constructed as to make travelling along its course hazardous in the extreme, and very slow, by the cunning use of traffic lights and a single-lane contraflow system along most of its length, coupled with a myriad of cone-shaped obstacles positioned to trap the unwary. By some curious quirk of fate, or more likely by a simple bureaucratic error made by some lowly, badly paid copy scribe, disgruntled at being posted to, as he saw it, the back of beyond, the blueprints of the designs of both the northern and southern boundary walls were somehow confused and mixed together in the main planning office filing cabinet. Thus, instead of the two planned walls, one to be built in the north, the other in the south, the blueprints became combined into a single wall, guarding both north and south at the same time. This arrangement, although unorthodox in the extreme, did in fact possess some plus points in its favour, not least of which was that the construction costs alone would be reduced by half, if not 50%, as only one wall was required instead of two. Additionally, the savings in the recurring costs of personnel to guard the wall were not inconsiderable, because the number of legions required to garrison the wall could similarly be slashed. As the ruling Roman Senate were keen to keep defence spending to a minimum, as ruling Senates always are, the accidentally combined wall plan was accepted. Chief Planning Officer and brick merchant Hadrian Cerberus Wallendii granted permission for the wall's construction because it was designed to avoid any environmentally sensitive areas, and the land was not in demand for any other purposes. Furthermore, the land was comparatively cheap, well, free actually. According to contemporary records, there were no objections from the residents to the application, therefore there was no question of compensation payments having to be made. So in effect, the implementation of the updated wall plan, if a defensive wall was required, was a bit of a no-brainer to the Roman accountants and financial masters. I use the description no-brainer in the sense that most accountants have no brain. Because capitalists, please note, they by necessity choose to see the fulfillment of a project only in financial terms and not in terms of the utility of the completed project. Due to the extended time of construction, the wall itself was never officially opened or named. Subsequently, the name of the chief planning officer, the only known Romano Geordie, was corrupted by the guttural Geordie tongue and over time abbreviated to Hadrian S. Wall. And today his name is still used in relation to this mammoth white elephant. Modern historians have questioned the continued recurring expense of guarding the wall because, let's face it, who would want to steal it? Looking on the bright side, as all good Romans should, the wall's construction did provide much-needed employment for the slaves. At a time of unparalleled unemployment, the slaves also benefited by being on reduced floggings during periods of inclement weather, which were not exactly unknown in these parts. Today, Hadrian's Wall, as it is still commonly referred to, can be easily followed from coast to coast, stretching the 79 miles from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east. The wall has steadily fallen into ruin during the 2 millennia since the Roman occupation. However, even today, what remains of the wall are impressive and imposing for most of its length, giving some indication as to the forbidding scale and grandeur of the original construction. From a modern perspective, some scholars and defence analysts maintain that the building of the wall was unnecessary because it apparently defended bugger all, dismissing the wall as a white elephant, a somewhat illogical analogy given that the same term could be used to describe a Roman armoured vehicle in winter camouflage. But more positive observers readily point out that because the province was never invaded during the 400 years of Roman domination, the wall, it could be argued, was particularly successful and achieved all it was designed to do. The wall was a strong and stable political statement. Apparently, it also became something of a religious icon to the many devotees of the god Mithras, who were stationed along the wall. Numerous inscribed wooden tablets, unearthed at Vindolanda, one of a chain of Roman supermarkets, provide a tantalizing glimpse into the everyday existence of the average GI, or more properly, RI, as a foot soldier in the Roman army was commonly referred to. Many of the inscriptions recorded individual prayers or personal requests to the gods for favour. The great number of prayers recovered indicate that Hadrian's wall, at least for some time, acted in a similar manner to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, providing a symbolic receptacle for the supplicants' devotions. One individual, who had unwillingly been stationed at the nearby fort of Corstopitum for some considerable time, prayed daily, sometimes twice if he wasn't out raping and pillaging. As it appeared that his devout pleas were still being ignored by his obviously otherwise engaged deity, he confided to the tablets that seeking divine favour was just like hitting his head against a brick wall. Following recent excavations at several remote locations along the wall, senior archaeologist Doug Pitt, Professor of Romano-British Studies and resident pick and shovel merchant for the unopened university, has postulated that the intensity and frequency of the physical act of Mithraic worship may have been a major factor contributing to the eventual destruction of the wall. When all the northern teams were relegated to lower divisions at the end of AD 382-3 season, Emperor Magnus Maximus, which literally means bigger than big, honestly it does, decided to temporarily withdraw some of his supporters from the north and west, because attendances at arranged battles had fallen significantly. He also resolved to send some of his elite troops home on R&R, ostensibly to support his European Cup ambitions, but in reality to reduce expenditure from the saculus civilis, or civil purse, on season tickets, concessions and services. These seemingly innocuous and everyday decisions had the unfortunate knock-on effect of seriously damaging international trading. As a direct consequence, imports of brown ale to the province were severely curtailed. As local supplies could not hope to meet local demand, brown ale rationing was brutally and sadistically imposed upon the local proletariat. These momentous and hard-hitting events constituted conclusive proof that Magnus Maximus was not bigger than Big Geordie, as it was his hand that signalled the events that led directly to enforced rationing and exorbitantly inflated prices, and proved to be the beginning of the end for the Geordies' now former foreign benefactors. As the reality of another unwarranted increase in prices for season tickets and the continued brown ale shortage hit home, the dual spectres of rebellion and civil disobedience started to manifest themselves within the common Geordie breasts. Please note they also manifested themselves in the common male population as well. Soon, a growing groundswell of socialist ideas began to fuel widespread civil unrest. In response, the Roman authorities opted to crush all socialist ideology with such brutality that even moderate and reasonable everyday Geordies, i.e. the proverbial Geordie on the clapped-out omnibus, were eventually persuaded to act against their Roman oppressors. To highlight the conditions under which most of the population were living, workers started to withdraw their labour, despite being slaves, contracted to work for nothing, and were often beaten senseless and even to death if they disobeyed their master's commands. A series of strikes and works to rule at the major Roman manufacturing centres saw productivity plummet, leading to the laying off of hundreds of skilled slaves from the giant Fiat chariot plant and the trireme yards on the Tyne, leading to the eventual collapse of those major industries. And huge unemployment and shortages became de rigueur. As a result of capitalistic logic, the economy of the province was basically wiped out overnight. Share prices tumbled and inflation spiraled. Goods became increasingly scarce, and would-be aggressors and company predators from beyond the hitherto impregnable borders were beginning to take notice and move in to threaten the weakened and bankrupt provincial industries. And worst of all, brown ale production ceased altogether. In a scenario reminiscent of the negative profitability footing of President Trump's failed casino empire, this is not fake news by the way, Roman Enterprises UK Limited had been suffering from bad management and serious liquidity problems for some time. The untimely industrial relations crisis proved to be the last straw for the mob bosses, and when company shares fell to 25% of nominal value, a winding up order or papal jihad was issued. In accordance with this directive, on the historic day of the 24th of August 410 AD, Rome was sacked when company CEO Luigi Francesco Salvatore Rome was relieved of his post and was sent home in disgrace and a top-of-the-range coffin. As the final nail of which was hammered home, the company effectively fell into involuntary administration. Capiche? As the last Monday of August, the day of the bank holiday, does not fall on the same date each year, the historic date of the 24th of August will always satisfy the qualifying criterion for the holiday celebration, because the last Monday must fall between the 24th and the 31st of that month. Therefore, few Geordies today are aware that the bank holiday actually commemorates Northumbria's liberation from Roman rule. On that same day, in 410 AD, the former Roman province of Northumbria, by default, regained its independence as a kingdom, and consequently, the prolonged and tortuous age of rudderless and incompetent bureaucracy aforetime mentioned within this narrative commenced. The road to damnation is indeed paved with confused, unworkable, illogical, and damaging Thatcherite monetary policies, enacted purely for the short-term financial gains of the acolytes and cronies of the Supreme High Priestess. As future generations condemned to a life under the overwhelming evil and cruel machinations of successive failed Thatcherite governments will readily testify. As more foreign workers and the military elite returned home or were posted away, Northumbria's defensive wall became increasingly garrisoned only by auxiliaries, or a second 11 as they were to become called by the more affluent ruling classes in future times, and as reserves by their more working class and lowly contemporaries. This cautionary tale highlights how apparently inconsequential but ill-considered and penny-pinching monetary policies aimed at reducing community expenditure can have unexpected and far-reaching effects upon the people and the economy its former investment was originally intended to benefit. When the final day of departure dawned, sort of anti-D-Day if you like, the whole provincial army, which had been ordered to assemble at the main chariot park in Sedgedounham Fort, conveniently situated at the eastern end of the wall, i.e. the wall's end, were in total disarray, having been standing to attention in parade fashion for some considerable time, because no one had any idea in which direction to march. Those in charge were totally clueless. Yes, it's a fact that some things just never change, and had not the slightest notion of which way to go. In mitigation, it must be remembered that the senior officers all belonged to the ruling class, and the most likely to vote Conservative in a future democracy, and were, like their modern-day counterparts, as thick as the proverbial material usually consigned to a pig's latrine, referred to in Roman times as pecorum stercore. The main man, now ex-provincial governor, the Right Honourable Incompetent Don Luigi Getta Agrippa, was in the process of having a nervous breakdown, or nervous naufragii, as it was known to the medicorum doctorum, because the Don had been prevented from making a logical, calm, well-considered scientific appraisal as to which direction they should set off to initiate this truly momentous, triumphant and glorious strategic retreat, due to his total ignorance of geography, map reading, chariot timetables and where he was, and had been stalling for a couple of hours hoping for divine intervention. During this extended unscheduled outbreak of Latin restlessness, frustration and immobility, the Geordie clan leaders had a bit of a conflab in an emergency, completely extraordinary general meeting, to explore the ways to hasten the bloody foreigners, their words not mine, departure. But being true northern folk, the Geordies didn't have a clue about anything beyond the Watfordian Gap, let alone the whereabouts of the Rome head office, or the Gap itself for that matter, and singularly failed to come up with a cunning plan, possible copyright infringement alert, in their impromptu conflab. As luck would have it, One bright Geordie warrior, whose name has unfortunately been lost to history, in desperation, helpfully informed the main man, in a genuine spirit of magnanimous commiseration and an obvious desire to expedite their final departure, that he had been working away in the Roman city of Leeds-Alander, and he vaguely remembered that the city lay somewhere to the south of the province, and could easily be reached by simply following the A1 south. He further suggested to a now incredulous ex-governor that on reaching the aforementioned settlement, he could inquire from a local there regarding the directions of their onward journey. Being a devout, casual and irregular die-hard worshipper of Mithras, the Roman god of friendship, contract and order, a somewhat ironic deity given the current circumstances, Don Get Agrippa truly believed that the simple disclosure of a now unknown warrior was inspired by the gods, well, one god anyway. At this revelation, the until now despondent ex-governor immediately perked up, believing he had been shown the way to attain his destiny and qualify for his pension. He saw his salvation in leading the proud and mighty ex-provincial army to the first ever victorious strategic retreat of Roman military forces in history. As the magnitude and significance of this so-called divine revelation sank in, his renewed confidence in a glorious future for himself was bolstered when at that precise moment he happened to recall the mantra that every citizen of Rome is made aware of from birth, that all roads roam to Leeds. Now convinced that his destiny is assured, and that the Ides of March he had for so long been aware of and feared simply referred to the day of an extended journey on foot, and not some mystical portent of disaster occurring during the calendar month of the same name, he really perked up. Assuming an almost imperious demeanour, the Right Honourable Incompetent sat bolt upright in his necessarily raised saddle and spurred his specially imported white thoroughbred Tyrolean donkey to face the massed ranks of his legions, impatiently awaiting his command. He raised a majestic right hand in the universally understood gesture demanding silence. As the deafening hubbub subsided and those who had not been paying attention faced front, he passionately addressed his adoring troops, and the few locals who had bothered to turn up and persevered long enough to witness this historic moment. Being what he believed to be an original thinker, and having employed a smart and cunning campaign speechwriter who could write, albeit in Latin, the former governor did not commence his oration in the traditional and bog-standard opening of "Friends, Romans, countrymen, can I borrow your headphones?" but with the more inventive, informative and inspiring words, the immortal epithet, "Legions of Rome. I have in my hand an order from the Emperor himself, to hearten and inspire us and the locals who have for so long suffered under our tyranny and enslavement, as we prepare to embark on our epic journey." He says, and I quote, "For youse lot, the war is over. No more cushy billets for youse bonny lads. It's been reet tough back here, and I can't afford any wasters. So if you have not learned the secret recipe of brown ale, divn't bother coming back." We're the lads. Following these comforting and uplifting words from Magnum Cassium or Big Cheese himself, former Governor Agrippa then proceeded to deliver his own morale-boosting farewell speech by summing up the important legacy of the Imperial Roman presence in an impromptu "What have the Romans done for the Brits" session. He was somewhat perplexed that his words had somehow incited feelings of anger and resentment in the growing number of interested Geordie locals present, even though they were aware that the Romans at last were buggering off, and they were free once more after so many years under the yoke of Roman domination. It became obvious, even to Get Agrippa, that it would not take much to provoke a violent reaction from the peasants, as the more daring and radical locals searched for empty bottles to use as weapons. The now tearful assembly began to get agitated and concerned, so as the shadow of the trireme builder's sundial crept to precisely 11 o'clock 100 hours, Central European time, the Right Honourable Incompetent ex-provincial governor Don Luigi Guidel Giuseppe Get Agrippa instigated the first ever Jarra March with the now time-honoured phrase, "Bugger this for a game of soldiers. Inceps primus centuro dutinus maximus Mount Vestra asinus," which in Geordie means "Prime Centurion Glutinus Maximus, mount your ass," finishing with the suggestion, "Let's get the flock out of here." I believe that this command was a reference to herding the livestock the procession would rely on for food during their journey. As they moved swiftly off towards the future location of the Tyne Tunnel, they consigned the Roman occupation of Northumbria to the history books. As history records, yet Agrippa was ultimately successful in achieving everlasting glory and acclaim by this triumphant withdrawal from Northumbria, which incidentally inaugurated the beginnings of a fine tradition that future Latin-speaking commanders have happily, wholeheartedly, and proudly sought to emulate, wherever and whenever they have been deployed. It might interest you, my dear friends, and amuse devotees of Schadenfreude, to learn that the final march was hampered and severely delayed by snarl-ups caused by the failure of the alleged temporary traffic signals and the single-lane contraflow on the southbound carriageway of the A1. As I alluded to earlier, in this engrossing, factual and fast-paced account of a very important stage in the history of Northumbria, it is very clear that some things just never change.
In any shooting gallery where promises are made to walk away, walk away, walk away, walk away from color coats and Whitley Bay, had to walk away. And girl, it looks so pretty to me, like it always did, like the Spanish city to me when we were kids. Girl, it looks so pretty to me, like it always did, like the Spanish city to me when we were kids.
Previously on Kingdom of Northumbria. Local legends and folk tales, believed to have originated in the northern highland region of Northumbria, allude to the existence of a unique species of cattle. The famous white cattle of Chillingham lend some credence or basis for these legends because the white cattle truly do exist and are a completely wild, undomesticated species. Unsurprisingly, their modern-day descendants have not to date exhibited any of the characteristics attributed to the cattle depicted in the archaic tales, because they tell of a particular breed of cow that could actually jump over the moon. Although suggestions of a methane-propelled bovine projectile are fundamentally and scientifically sound, our research has been unable to substantiate the existence of this mythical beastie. and the legend perhaps was real only in the imagination of the ancient tribe's elders, who would forswear anything during their narcotic-induced religious ceremonies. Northumbria has its fair share of bizarre tales. Take that of the Lambton Worm, for example. The tale tells of the existence of an alleged immortal superworm. According to the legend, this super beastie was imprisoned at Congannis Fort, a Roman stronghold in what is now County Durham. So technically, this story does not truly belong within this narrative. However, it is possible that the worm had originally migrated south, that is to say, wormed its way south in traditional Tory fashion. Anywho, to continue the tale, the villainous beast was somehow captured and held under remand at the fort awaiting trial, because it was alleged that it had the nasty antisocial habit of eating people. An activity that even the mafiosi were keen to discourage because of its possible detrimental effect on business. Before magistrates came to pass legal judgment, the worm escaped because it felt that it was being framed to take the fall for the crimes of another superworm which bore an uncanny resemblance to it, which when you think about it is quite reasonable, and its pleas of innocence fell on deaf ears, even after it revealed that it couldn't have committed the crime it had been arrested for, because it was a practicing vegetarian. After silently slithering over the east wall of the fort at the dead of tea time, the worm made good its escape, taking refuge at an improvised hideout on Penshire Hill. To cut a long and somewhat tedious tale short, a local mafia bounty hunter come castle builder called John Lambton was given the contract to bump the worm off, to restore both the mob's honour and business to former levels by eliminating the supposed cause of the recent downturn in fortunes. Ultimately, Lambton succeeded in befriending the worm and gained its confidence during one of their all-night drinking sessions. After all, the worm was vegetarian, not teetotal, and as the big clock struck midnight, Lambton slew the worm by honourably stabbing it in the back, and hence the beastie was no more. The mafia were happy, capiche, because business was restored to previous levels. The populace were happy because they wouldn't get eaten anymore, at least by the worm. And the Romans were happy because their impeccable reputation for prisoner security had begun to go down the pan in a similar fashion to those of Securicor and Group 4 had done before. Therefore, the whole episode was a win-win-win situation, much unlike those encountered by the local football teams. However, it must be remembered that the worm never came to a trial, nor was convicted of any other crimes, so a question mark must remain over the community's leadership, because technically an innocent worm had been murdered in the name of justice. Another bizarre and ultimately perplexing item of local folklore is that relating to the origin of the now famous Geordie fish and chips banquet. It is known that the origin of the fish and chip banquet certainly reaches at least as far back as the Roman occupation of Northumbria. There is anecdotal evidence to suggest that the practice of preparing food by heating it in melted animal fat was introduced by Greek soldiers stationed in Britannia while participating in joint NATO exercises with the Roman army, because apparently they claimed that fish and chips was a traditional dish often cooked in Greece. Personally, I believe that this is a case of contemporary mistranslation, but we do not know for sure. However, we do know that the Geordie staple was first described by the renowned and now quite dead historian Canisius Benicium, which actually translates as can of beans. An obscure reference dated 245 AD, or quarter to 3 in Britcoin, in one of his 57 Geordie Britannia blogs of that year. The 14th sonnet of the 21st blog, old Benicium records, Piscis et chips et prenems batellis apud crustulum stoti et brunas cervicia refresciendum, which you will no doubt know translates as fish and chips and peas pudding, with stotty cake and brown ale as refreshment, which the listener will appreciate is quite a mouthful in any language. And thus this could possibly be the main factor as to why this simple dish has continued to satisfy Geordie appetites for countless generations. Old Benicium also records an account by the 25th Legion's medical officer, Titus Officius. An entry in his private diary refers to the Great Famine of 239 AD, where he describes in some detail the extent of the suffering endured by the local tribes. But there was no to eat, not even a stale stotty. All the folks went hungry, and many more went potty. is a loose translation from the original document. The word potty in the account is generally accepted to mean crazy, and not some childish reference to relieving oneself, because at the time of the Great Famine, brown ale was severely rationed. Indeed, at that sad time, the sight of a bottle of brown ale was as rare as a sexually fully equipped male brass monkey in January. So personal intake of liquid fell to almost zero, generally negating the need to go potty to relieve oneself. These accounts are widely accepted as authentic and contemporary because the dates when they were written correlate with the major events they refer to. Plus there is corroborating evidence that both Roman chroniclers were indeed stationed in Northumbria at that precise time. Therefore the veracity of the accounts are not in question. However, closer examination of the details show a number of discrepancies within the texts that perplex historians and scholars. Firstly, and it's a biggie, is the fact that potatoes were unknown in Europe or the known world until Elizabethan times, when they were first encountered and introduced from the New World, which raises the obvious question of how did the Geordies make chips? Secondly, brown ale was not brewed until the 20th century, when the singular nectar was created down south in 1927. Another major problem identifying fish and chips, as mentioned in the Roman blog, with the modern Geordie dish fish and chips, is that the ancient document refers to the serving of a portion of the highly prized delicacy peas pudding, whereas genuine Geordie fish and chips are optionally, and I emphasise the word optionally, accompanied by mushy peas as an enhancement to the main dish, and never ever by peas pudding. To serve peas pudding with fish and chips to a guest would be considered an insult in the extreme and constitute a social gaffe of the highest order. Narcotics and the fertile imagination were indeed the basis on which the now debunked fake news stories of the Lambton Worm and Kessie, the Killingworth Lake plesiosaur, were built. However, as luck would have it, while filming for this mockumentary, our film crew did witness an event that had all the spectacle and drama of a space-travelling ruminant. Despite the animal involved being physically much smaller in scale and less extrovert than the average cow, even a mythical one, as you will see on your screens, it involved an everyday encounter between a fox and a rabbit. What resulted from the encounter was not so mundane, at least from the observer of a regular life or death chase scenario, because the rabbit took on the cunning persona of former rodent superhero Bugs Bunny, when amazingly it refused to succumb to Wile E. Coyote's canines in the time-honoured fashion. Instead, the rabbit adopted the ingenious and ultimately successful expedient of jumping over its would-be nemesis to make good its escape, leaving the fox totally lost, confused and defeated, and I suspect hungry, as Bugs Bunny aficionados would expect. Clearly this is not an everyday outcome to the average fox-rabbit encounter, and I was very lucky to be on hand to make a video record of it for posterity. But it just goes to prove that despite all of mankind's knowledge and technological advances, nature can still spring surprises. And animals, just like people, are capable of incredible feats of wanton stupidity and embarrassment. Therefore, in an effort to get a possible money-spinning video, a vlog, on YouTube, is it so unreasonable to suggest that a cow might be able to jump high enough to vault the moon? Well, my friends, that's it. Doesn't time fly when you are enjoying yourself? I'm sure you'll be delighted to know that I have come to the end of my little spiel. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed it, and that I have in some little way helped you to know the wonderful kingdom of Northumbria just a little bit more. If you would like more, you're in luck, because I'll leave you now with a few final comments. If you don't, well, tough titty, here it is anyway. You can switch off if you like, but you will never know just what goodies you'll be missing. It's your loss. Missing you already, Bruce. This short but beautifully crafted illustration, I hope, has highlighted some of the many species, often unseen, extant within my local neighbourhood. On a personal note, it is very gratifying to see how nature, at least within St. Mary's local nature reserve, have benefited from the preservation of a marginal area in close proximity to a large urban development. All it takes is a little thought and the will to make a difference to your own local habitat and the way we live. The images of seal pups playing with a discarded plastic bag amply illustrate the dangers plastics pose to wildlife. But what about the dangers posed to the environment, otherwise known as nature's life support system, by the ubiquitous plastics we can't see. A lot more needs to be done, even on a small scale. We cannot be complacent, nor neglectful. As the salesman said, when it's gone, it's gone. No more stock expected. Preserving wilderness areas and encouraging local wildlife can only benefit mankind by preserving that on which everything was created in the first place, the earth, ensuring a healthy, diverse and balanced population of species. Only time will tell whether the message will get through to the powers that be. Man cannot run roughshod over nature any longer. Nature will eventually win out some way or the other, because man is a product of nature. It is of paramount importance that serious and concerted efforts worldwide are implemented immediately to attempt to correct the damage we have already done to the planet. It is already too late for the many species we have already forced into extinction. But it is not, I hope, too late to make a telling difference to the world. I am pessimistic. While collectively, man has the intelligence and ability to reverse the effects he has had and continues to have on the globe's natural ability to sustain life, does he really have the collective will and determination to at least try? The selfishness, greed, aggression and hedonism endemic of modern civilization, in short, human nature, coupled with our political leadership's short-sighted economics and often conflicting religious attitudes and beliefs, do not in themselves instill me with any faith in a successful outcome on this score. Purely by chance, I happened to be writing this at the time of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. This outbreak, timely in terms of this narrative, starkly illustrates how modern, so-called civilized man is likely to respond to similar or worse scenarios. In a crisis, common sense is likely to be the first casualty as man's basic survival instincts kick in. Individuals will use all their cunning to mitigate any effects that crisis may create to ensure his own and his loved ones' survival. Ironically, it is viral mutations triggering an organism's response to infection that dictate that organism's level of immunity and subsequent longevity. Unfortunately, human interaction, modern interdependency, and easy movement of goods and people facilitates rapid dissemination of infection by reducing the time available for those infected to produce the necessary antibodies to kill the virus before transmission. I'm concerned that continued exponential population growth and mankind's alleged inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will ultimately destroy the golden goose, a semi-biological analogy there. Earth's resources are finite. That is a stark reality, and there will come a time in the not-so-distant future when competition for those resources will inevitably become more acute and dangerous. It is physically impossible for technological advances and increased crop yields to keep pace. Even an optimistic appraisal of possible future food production will have to be radically revised in light of the combined effects of global warming and climate change. To me, it is only a matter of time before the ghost of Malthus manifests itself upon the world. And notwithstanding all mankind's actual and presumed future efforts to save himself, and by default the planet, the only realistic and practical way forward for mankind's long-term residency on Earth is to limit the birth rate, to intentionally and voluntarily reduce world population. There is no choice. Is it not preferable and more humane to self-regulate than to have to succumb to the horrors of war, pestilence and famine, or even a cataclysmic geological or extraterrestrial event beyond our control? The plain fact is that any organism will always struggle to combat a new virus, because it is impossible to develop an antidote for something that is yet to evolve. And there is no such thing as a panacea. A logical and humane method designed to reverse population growth was implemented by diktat of the Chinese government. The one offspring per couple policy was enlightened, but soon abandoned because it didn't work in practice, despite the fact that adherence was enforced by law within an autocratic society. The only realistic and humane solution would be compulsory sterilization of both parents after the birth of their one child. In a democracy, a policy of voluntary birth control is unlikely to see the light of day. because how many citizens would vote for a government advocating total birth control? Therefore, when the nuts come to the cracker, enforced sterilisation is the only option, which raises the question of who is to decide on those who are to be sterilised, or restricted to a single offspring, and those that are to enforce and oversee compliance. Any such programme, however well intentioned, will ultimately and inevitably result in civil unrest, as inequality, jealousy, discrimination, race, resentment, prejudice and religion manifest themselves amongst the populace.
I wandered the street and the gay crowded places, trying to forget you, but somehow it seems my thoughts ever stray to our last sweet embraces.